Hello, and welcome to Finding American Immigrant Ancestors in Passenger Lists, an overview of sources from the 18th to the 20th century. My name is Robin Degeratu, and I work for Centre County Library and Historical Museum in the Pennsylvania Room, a genealogical and historical reference library. And we're so pleased to partner with local genealogist and historian Justin Hauser, who will present today's interesting and exciting talk. Throughout the presentation, you'll notice a lot of information on the slides. These can be downloaded via the link that is in the description of this video. In the description of the video, you'll also find links to lots of other interesting information that illuminates some of what Justin will talk about today. With that, Justin, please go ahead and take it away.
All right, well, thank you, Robin. As Robin said, I will lead you through this, this information on the slides that hopefully you all can see. And at the end, we'll try to address any questions. I don't bill myself as any kind of formally trained expert in genealogy. I simply wish to share the results of what has become my lifelong passion and decades of research. So you'll see what's been drawn on my own research, my own knowledge, my own findings. With a focus, of course, given the nature of the topic and the nature of the audience, on primarily on those passenger lists that relate to the groups of immigrants whose descendants found their way to central Pennsylvania, which probably will impact many of you. And that's a broad scope of individuals. My own roots in Centre County run very, very, very deep. And my immigrant ancestors range from some very, very early German Mennonites who arrived in the 1680s in Pennsylvania, all the way up through to some Ukrainian, Eastern European immigrants. My great-grandmother came in 1920 through Ellis Island. So hopefully, no matter where on the spectrum of waves of immigration history you fall, you might find something useful in this presentation. Now, I just have to, oh, there we go. So there are a lot of myths and there are a lot of confusions surrounding immigration records and passenger lists. A lot of people have the story that their ancestor's name was changed at Ellis Island. Well, that myth involves a lot of things, a lot of assumptions, one of which is that Ellis Island was the place where the ancestor arrived, which in some cases is true, but in many cases is not. There were no wholesale name changes at Ellis Island. I'll just tell you that right now, but we'll get into that in detail. But hopefully through this talk, we will learn where these records of these passenger arrivals are located, how we can research them, what they can tell us so that we can present a clear story of our family's history. So what might surprise you is that, at least for the United States, speaking on a federal governmental level here, before 1820, there are no systematic passenger lists. They were not required by law to be recorded. However, that doesn't mean that they don't exist or that the information in them can't be located in many cases, but it's a little bit of a struggle. So I'm going to divide this talk into two parts, really. I'm going to talk about pre-1820 immigrants and how to try to find their passenger arrival information. And then in the second part, we'll talk about post-1820 immigrants, which is a little bit of a different foray into sets of records. Now, in Pennsylvania, three of the main groups of immigrants before 1820 whose descendants found their way to Centre County include the Germans, the Pennsylvania Dutch, as they're often called, who were really from Germany, parts of France, Switzerland, and adjoining areas. The Scots Irish, who we talked about last year in some depth, who were mainly Protestant, Presbyterian people from the lowlands of Scotland, the bordering areas, who first moved to Ireland, Northern Ireland in the 1600s and 1700s, and then came to North America soon thereafter. And the third group, of course, especially in the Philadelphia area, but with many descendants in the valleys of central Pennsylvania, are the Quakers, many of whom were English in background, but many of whom were also Irish in background. You even have a few German Quakers. So we'll get into some of that information as well. So let's start with the Germans, because I think they're the easiest. If you have Germans before 1820, you have a lot of chances to find information on their immigration and arrival. The main source is what I have captured in a screenshot there, a little photo of the 3-volume series called Pennsylvania German Pioneers by Ralph Beaver Strasburger and William John Hincke, which was published in 1934 by the Pennsylvania German Society. And we're going to take a look at those records in a few moments. So let's talk about why we have such good passenger lists for these German immigrants in the 1700s and early 1800s, and we don't have them for other nationalities in quite the same way. So here's a copy of some minutes of the Provincial Council of Pennsylvania from 1727, which is when these really good immigration lists start. And that picture there is actually a picture from the book. It shows Philadelphia Harbor in 1754, what it looked like with all of these ships coming in at this major port. But as you can see there, it says that at this council meeting, the governor told the board that there had been 400 Palatines, which is Palatine was the Palatinate was a region in Germany, and Palatines was often a sort of linguistic shorthand for all these Germans coming from the region. And they're concerned that all of these Germans are coming. They're not making any application to the Pens or to the government for any lands. They're going to come and take all of these lands. They are ignorant of our language and laws. They're settling in a body together, making a distinct people from His Majesty's subjects, and they're concerned that their security will be endangered by such numbers of strangers daily poured in. My, doesn't that sound familiar? This has been a question, I think, throughout the history of North America. So, what did the Provincial Council decide to do about this situation? Well, they considered it, and they determined that these people needed to make an oath of allegiance and swear their allegiance to the King of Great Britain, and to promise fidelity to the proprietor, which would be the Penn family, and obedience to our established Constitution. And so 'tis ordered, it says, and I think that yes. So what they required to be done in this case to facilitate the taking of these oaths was that a list shall be taken of the names of all these people, their several occupations, and the places from whence they come, and shall be further examined touching their intentions in coming hither. And further, that a writing be drawn up for them to sign, declaring their allegiance and subjection to the King of Great Britain, and fidelity to the proprietary of this province, and that they will demean themselves peaceably towards all His Majesty's subjects, and strictly observe and conform to the laws of England and of this government. That's why we have such good passenger lists for the German arrivals at Philadelphia, because the provincial government was very concerned about the massive influx of Germans, and wanted to ensure that they could be they would not present a security risk to the province. So they started making these lists and having these people take oaths when they arrived. So what do these lists look like? Well, on the right-hand side is a page from the Pennsylvania German Pioneers typewritten lists, which were taken from the originals in the Pennsylvania archives. There were 3 lists. So first in 1727, the captain was supposed to make his list. Now, in many cases, especially in the early years, these are very good because they include the names, sometimes the ages of the people. And it was supposed to be their occupation and where they were from. That was almost never recorded, unfortunately. The second list was the list of the oaths of allegiance to the British Crown. And the third was the oaths of abjuration and fidelity to the proprietor and laws of the province, which became a separate oath in 1729. So you see here a transcript. So this is list 6B. So a B list would be the second list on here, an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. So these people signed their names, swearing their allegiance to the British Crown, arriving on the ship Morton House from Rotterdam, which is where most of these ships had left, and then stopped at Deal in England on the 15th of June, 1728. And these people were signing their names on the 24th of August, 1728. So they apparently had arrived probably that day or a day or two before that, perhaps. Now, you can see that some of these people, their names are just written out, and some of them have these little parentheses with these marks. And so what these things indicate are that the individual could not or did not sign his own name. And so they made an X, or this one here, he was able to make a W. This one made an O. This one made a cross. This one signed HKM, apparently Hans Kitzmiller, and he signed for the fellow below him, and so forth and so on. And I picked this page because some of my distant relatives, Uli Schirch and Udri Schirch from Switzerland, who settled in Lancaster County, are listed here. So that's an example of what you can get on the lists. Unfortunately, most of the time, the lists only contain the names of males 16 years of age and upwards who swore the oath. Sometimes you get lists of the entire family that arrived, but that's relatively rare. So where do you find these lists? Well, the first 9 years of them were actually reported to the provincial council name for name and are printed in the colonial records of the Pennsylvania Archives. Rupp, a historian in the 19th century, abstracted them into a book commonly called his 30,000 Names of the Immigrants, although there are a lot of typos and misreadings and so forth in there. So the best source by far is the one I indicated, the Pennsylvania German Pioneers set from 1934, which is in the Pennsylvania Room. Now, this is what the original lists look like. And helpfully, in volume 2 of Pennsylvania German Pioneers, they meticulously reproduced, which was something in 1934, these signature lists. And so you see, this is what they look like. So you can take the one volume with the printed text, find that ship in the second volume, and even if you can't read the German very well, you can count down the number of names and look for the marks, and you'll be able to figure out which one is the one you're looking for. So right here, you can see that Johannes Kitzmiller, and there's his HKM, and there where it says he signed for Conrad Ritt. And here's my Schirch relatives, Uli Schirch and Udri Schirch. Now, obviously, those lists were kept from 1727 because the arrival of so many Germans was becoming a problem in Pennsylvania. But what about before 1727? Well, all is not lost if you have very early German immigrants. There were approximately 3,000 Germans who came to New York in 10 ships in 1709 and 1710, called the 1709ers. Who were, it's a long story that I won't go into now, but if you have roots in that migration, it's a fascinating tale of how these people went to England, and then some went to Ireland, and they were in these camps, and they were supposed to be working to produce tar, but the trees weren't right, and they were promised this land, and they didn't get this land. It's really quite a story, but the end result is a lot of these New York 1709ers eventually ended up in Pennsylvania. So if you have roots among them, there were a lot of records kept of the transportation of these settlers and these colonists. And a lot of that is abstracted and compiled by Henry Jones in a series of books. There are 4 sets of books. I've listed them down there at the bottom of the slide. The library, the Pennsylvania Room of the Center County Library has all of these. They are a phenomenal resource on these families. and even some later. Mr. Jones continued his work past the 1709ers to do more Palatine families and even more Palatine families that he found in his work and tied them to their immigration and their origins in Europe where he could. Another set of very helpful records, if you have Germans before or after 1727, really, are the works of Annette Kunzelman Bergert, who devoted the better part of a couple of decades to compiling lists of and records of immigrants from southwestern Germany and adjacent areas to Pennsylvania and North America. And there's a list of her publications there on the left, at least the major ones. And what she did was she used the passenger lists where they were available, but she also looked in areas of Germany and German-speaking lands where there were known to be a lot of immigrants coming to North America at that time in the 1700s. And she combed the church records of each town and for any indication that someone had left for Pennsylvania or had left for America. And then she tried to match them up with any early colonial records of that person in America to try to help prove who the immigrant was on both sides of the Atlantic. So these are a phenomenal resource. And if you're looking for immigrant ancestors, Germans from the 1700s especially, you need to check these books very carefully, because even if the passenger list has not survived, you may find them chronicled in one of those books. Two other resources, Werner Hacker, he researched it from the other side of the Atlantic. There were different provinces and communities in southwestern Germany and adjacent areas that required people to be what was called manumitted or liberated from their serfdom obligations, essentially, to leave the territory. And so while we may not have a record of their arrival in North America, we may have a record indicating that they were cleared to leave their home community in Europe. And so even without a passenger list, it's probably the next best thing. So that book is available in the Pennsylvania Room. And another set, Faust's list of Swiss immigrants, again, based upon records that he found in Switzerland in various archives of people who were granted permission to leave Switzerland and come to North America. So that the Germans, you're in pretty good shape if you have early Germans. Now, what about if you have Scots Irish before 1820? Well, that's a lot harder. I'm just going to say that now. The main period of the Ulster immigration is indicated on that book there, which if you do have Scots Irish, you should get that book or borrow that book and read that book. And again, the Pennsylvania Room has that book too. The main wave was from 1718 to the beginning of the Revolution. And then after that, a second wave came of Scots Irish. And we talked about that in a presentation last year. Most of the Scots Irish during the main waves of immigration did come to Philadelphia, although quite a few also went to Newcastle, Delaware, Baltimore, Charleston, and elsewhere. Maybe 200,000 of them. There were up to 600,000 more in the second wave after the Revolution through the early 1840s, mostly Protestant, although there were some Catholic immigrants at that time. So what if you have Scots Irish immigrants? Where can you look for passenger lists or anything approximating it? Well, there is the book by Michael Tepper, Immigrants to Pennsylvania, which abstracts and compiles various miscellaneous passenger lists that have survived. It's not that ships didn't keep records of what they were doing and who was being transported in many cases, but the government didn't require them to archive those lists anywhere, and the government never asked to see those lists, with the exception of Germans in Pennsylvania. And so they're often not recorded anywhere, but sometimes things pop up and people find documents that have survived in private collections. And a number of these things were compiled in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. And Mr. Tepper's work sort of abstracts those. So a lot of Scots Irish, as many of you know, came as indentured servants. And there are at least 2 series in Philadelphia where the servants arriving on the ships who were indentured were bound out and assigned under contract to work for someone. And this occurred before the mayor of Philadelphia. And the records from 1745 and 46, as well as 72 and 73, have survived and have been printed. Now, it's not a huge coverage of time, but there are a lot of names. Those were some of the high periods of immigration for Scots Irish. So you may find names in there. They often give ages. They indicate what ship the person had come on and who they were indentured to. So you definitely need to check those lists. And perhaps someday more lists before other mayors of Philadelphia may perhaps emerge somewhere. There's another printing by the Pennsylvania German Society, which appears to cover another list or another year of 1771, in addition, that's worth checking. And the original of that book has actually been digitized on the website of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And you can go to their website and take a look at it, and you can see the original lists. But the printed books are all in the Pennsylvania room. And here's a screenshot of one of these records from these indentures that was on the American Philosophical Society. So we'll just look here at these 2. So there's a date there that's cut off, but all of these have dates on them. Daniel Flynn, a servant, assigned by Captain James Garrigous, to serve John Garrigous, to serve, I think that may have been a typo because then they wrote, or a handwriting mistake, they wrote to serve John Montgomery of East Marlborough Township, Chester County, and his assigns 4 years from the 30th September last, the time of arrival. So you get the name of the captain of the ship, so you might be able to figure out what ship arrived on the 30th of September, because there are some good lists of what ships arrived, and the consideration was 15 pounds. And then the next one on that day, Thomas McCormick, who was under an indenture of redemption, now canceled, in consideration of 9 pounds 1 shilling, paid for his passage from Ireland, bound a servant to Mordecai Evans of Limerick Township, Philadelphia County, and his assigns 2 years to be found all necessaries, and at expiration have 1 complete new suit of apparel besides his old. So again, these records vary as far as what they contain. Usually they don't say where in Ireland the person was from, unfortunately, but they might narrow down an exact date of arrival and the identity of who they were indentured to, which is really something for colonial Scots Irish immigrants. So do not overlook these records. Some more records that I've indicated there. The Scots Irish before 1820. There's a book by Raymond Adams that's on Ancestry.com that has some pre-1820 information. Pennsylvania started keeping in Philadelphia records of landing reports of aliens. There are not very many. I only found a few hundred in this record series on Family Search. They're self-declarations, but again, before 1820, check them because you never know. And then, of course, passport applications. Those start in 1795. So if your ancestor was here, became a citizen, and needed a passport to go somewhere abroad, they may be found in there. Although that's relatively rare, you never want to rule anything out. Now, Quakers. So I'm just going to throw in here, they often came very early, but the primary source of Quaker arrival information is actually often in the minutes of their monthly meetings, where they would indicate from which meeting they were transferring membership into their new monthly meeting. And a lot of times, these would be places in Europe, in Ireland or in England. And the date of transfer here may clue you into the approximate date that these folks arrived. So there are 2 books that are actually online. They're quite old, but again, if you have early Quakers, you may well want to look at those books. All right, what else can we do if we have pre-1820 arrivals? Well, I would be remiss if I did not talk about the work of P. William Philby. Most of his books are also in the Pennsylvania Room. He is now deceased, but he devoted a lot of time to combing books and records like the ones that I mentioned, as well as many other sources, to find any references to obscure passengers or arrivals that may not be picked up in standard passenger lists. And there's a 15-volume series that has over 3.8 million people in it. And so now what it'll give you in that book is it'll give you a name, a year, and then it'll give you a sort of a decimal point number. And then you go to the beginning of the book, and that decimal point number will tell you what the identity of the source is, where Mr. Philby and his associates found that name. And then if you get that reference, you'll see the immigration information that he discovered and he's linking to there. Carl Boyer's works on ship passenger lists to various areas tries to fill this gap by finding any early passenger lists that have survived. There are 4 volumes, as you can see, covering most of the East Coast. I know that the Pennsylvania Room has at least one of these books for the Pennsylvania and Delaware, and it may have one or more of the others. And then I talked about Michael Tepper and his consolidations. In addition to Pennsylvania, he did some for New York, New England, etc. So depending on where your family settled, you may want to check one or more of those volumes. Now, I said there are no pre-1820 passenger lists held by the National Archives. They were not required. That's true, but for some reason, we do have some Philadelphia passenger lists covering 1800 to 1819, and some New Orleans, Louisiana passenger lists covering 1813 to 1819. It appears that what these were actually customs cargo lists, and sometimes the ship's captain wrote the names of passengers on them. They're not believed to be very complete, but if your ancestor happened to be one of the ones that got noted on one of these lists that got kept with the customs records and has been preserved to this day, you are in luck. So I'll show you, this is what one of those lists looks like, and they're on Family Search. So as you can see, this is a customs list for a ship that was arriving in Philadelphia in, let's see here, I believe it says 1795, which is even earlier than it's supposed to be, but nevertheless, there it is. This is quite an early list, but you can see it has all of this rum and a lot of rum they're bringing, and then it says 4 passengers, Spaniards and their baggage, and then some trunks and so forth. And then at the bottom, they listed the passengers' names. Matthias Litaminda, he had a trunk and a box. Don Lewis Gill, he had a trunk and 3 boxes. Pepia Litaminda, and I may be butchering these names, but it looks like they beat me to it. And Watton, looks like Paris or Barris or something, had a trunk and 2 boxes. Again, that tells you very, very little, but that early, if that's your relative, and there you have at least what ship they came on and what baggage they brought with them. And so that's quite a find for that early. Oh, and here I zoomed in on it there, so you can see. Now again, most ships do not have these kind of things surviving before 1820, but for that 20-year period, some of them do. So you may want to take a look at that. So now let's talk about 1820 and forward. There's 2 groups of lists here, and they overlap a little bit, although generally speaking, between 1820 and 1891, most of what you're going to find will be what's called the customs lists. And from 1892 to 1957 is the date where most of these things stop online, but we'll talk about that later. But that's the era of what are what we think of as passenger lists. So we're going to walk through that process and explain how that all developed. So why do we have in 1820, the explosion of these really detailed documenting, increasingly detailed passenger lists, the customs lists. Well, there was a law passed in 1819, and March 2nd, 1819, and it regulated passengers and arrival and customs and things like that. And so, among other things, it required the ship captain to report to the customs district where the ship arrived a list or manifest of all the passengers taken on board of the said ship or vessel at any foreign port or place, in which list or manifest it shall be the duty of the said master to designate particularly the age, sex, and occupation of the said passengers, respectively, the country to which they severally belong, and that of which it is their intention to become inhabitants, and shall further set forth whether any and what number have died on the voyage. So we now get far more detailed lists of all of these immigrants and these passengers arriving on these ships. You'll note that this far back, there was really no restriction on immigration, at least from Europe, to the United States. These they had to document the passengers that were arriving, but there really was not a limitation on who could come here at that point. It was just if you're being brought in on a ship, then you need to, your ship captain needed to present a list to the customs officer so that they could have this information. And that started, that law took effect in 1820. Notice too that it does not require any list of people crossing over from the Canadian border, or for that matter, from the Mexican border at that time. There were separate lists kept of land arrivals from both places, but they don't start generally this early. So for ships, you're coming across on a ship, you're going to have these customs lists. So here's an example of a customs list from 1820 from Philadelphia, and this is from Family Search. So this is a ship, the ship Rebecca Sims. Daniel Brewston was the captain. The tonnage and who owned it was listed there in Philadelphia, and it was bound for Philadelphia. And this is just part of a passenger list, but you see the people's names are all set forth here. There's the lady Hannah, who's 27. There's Samuel, who's 2. Is he her son? Well, probably, but we can't prove that from this document, but it would make sense. And several other individuals here, including a gentleman who was 67, which is quite old to be crossing the Atlantic in those days. But to what country belonging? Well, these people were mostly from England, although the last 2 were actually from Philadelphia. Probably didn't need to be recorded here, but nevertheless, they over-included, which is good for us. Maybe these people were returning back to Philadelphia. This one was a merchant and this one was a gentleman. So they may have had business in England, and they were all intending to become residents of the United States. So this is what you get on one of these early customs lists. Again, a great improvement over anything before. Still not a lot of detail, but it pins down an arrival date and some details of who came. Now, we're going to fast forward to 1875 and look at another customs list that was required at that time. And you'll see that the information that's required really hasn't changed in 55 years. The same information about the ship is at the top. And then you have there a list of passengers. Now, these were saloon passengers, so not quite in steerage. You have some more professional individuals. You have Miss Augustine Menenjoy, it looks like, 32, a female, a spinster from France. Mr. Thornton Pike, 46, a merchant, and so forth and so on. Medical doctor there, intending to become inhabitants of the United States. So again, that's an 1875 customs list. Now, the customs lists continue up to 1891, and in many cases, they continue past 1891. But another law was passed around that time, which required another set of passenger lists, a true set of passenger lists to be created, and established a governmental department to start working on these and processing this information. So the Immigration Act of 1891 is the one we're talking about. There had been an Immigration Act in 1882 as waves of immigration continued to increase in the United States, and there were some regulatory controls put on. Probably the most famous of the laws from the late 1800s were the so-called Chinese Exclusion Acts, which progressively made it difficult and then impossible for immigrants from Asia essentially to come to the United States and settle. And that stayed in effect for quite some time. But the 1891 Act sets forth clearly, apart from, as it says here, Chinese laborers, which were already dealt with in those other laws, it was prohibited for all idiots, and these were medical definitions at the time, insane persons, paupers, or persons likely to become a public charge, persons suffering from a loathsome or dangerous contagious disease, persons who have been convicted of a felony or other infamous crime or misdemeanor involving moral turpitude, polygamists, and also any person whose ticket or passage is paid for with the money of another or who is assisted by others to come. That was to prevent the mass importation of contract laborers who were being brought in by employers who were paying their passage and getting them here to do really cheap labor. And then there was an exception made to somebody else paying for your ticket. And that was if you have a relative or a friend who's here and they paid for your ticket, that was not a problem. They just didn't want businesses doing this. And so obviously now that they set up this law and these requirements, they had to enforce it. They had to collect this information, and somebody had to keep track to make sure that these people were not being admitted. So they passed Section 8 of the statute here, and I think I may have highlighted, no, I didn't. So we're going to go back. So it says, and we'll just go down through this because it's very important. If an alien immigrant arrives by water, again, they didn't care yet about the ones coming by land, the officer of the vessel was to report the name, nationality, last residence. So now you're getting, in many cases, towns where these people came from, and destination of every such alien before any of them are landed to the proper inspection officers. And then these inspection officers went on board the vessel, they inspected everybody, and then if anybody was obviously diseased or a problem, they were to be removed for further inspection. And then it talks in some detail about that. And then it talks about the power to administer oaths, and they go on about how to care for these people until they determine what to do with them. So now you have these detailed lists, and you have people doing all kinds of health inspections of these folks and taking oaths. So this is a big change from what we had before. What kind of lists do these things generate? Well, starting in 1891, 1892, you start to get lists like this, because now you have this Commissioner of Immigration, you have these Treasury regulations from 1893, and so you have all of these official forms to gather all of the information that this law now requires. So here's a list of passengers on the ship Bohemia, sailing from Hamburg, Germany in 1895 and arriving at Philadelphia. And these ask all the questions that the law required them to now collect about these people. So here's a whole family of folks. And you see it, wife, daughter, son. So the relationships are now being given with more frequency. Their ages, their marital status, what their occupation was in some cases. Could they read or write? Where did they come from? What was their last residence? And then, unfortunately, this just gives you a province, although later they get down to start naming towns. Where was the ship arriving? Where were these people going? So these ones were going to, it looks like Hitchcock, South Dakota. Who paid for the passage? Again, that was an important question. How much money were these people bringing with them? Because again, were they going to become a public charge? Were they ever in the United States before? And if so, when? And where were they going? So this one here, they're going to this Jacob Franz Wolf they're all going to his brother Ignatz in South Dakota. So you know that there's already this relative living there. Maybe you want to try to find his record, his passenger record, and records about him. And then the standard questions about their health and whether they're a polygamist and so forth and so on. But you see how detailed these immigration passenger lists become. Here's another list from 1912. And this one here has my great-grandfather on it, Theodore Harenio, who became Fred Rainio in Bellefonte. This was his second crossing, and his information is listed there. You can see this is page 1 of 2. After about 1906, the lists became further expanded. Well, 1907, under this act of Congress, they asked more questions. So you see, here's his name, his age, his marital status, his sex, his occupation, farm laborer. He could not read or write. He was Austria, his nationality hidden under there was Ruthenian or Ukrainian. It's an older term that they used. Last permanent residence was Austria, and the city or town was Zavadka. So I have the village where he was from. Who was his nearest relative in the old country? It was his wife, and it gives her name there. Where was he going? He was going to Arlington, New Jersey, which makes sense because he had a brother there. I mean, it's something I happen to know. But even if I didn't know it, let me go back here because I need to see which line number I'm on. Line 8. There it is. So he's, in this case, he does not have a ticket. He paid for his own passage. Yes, he was in, I don't think I'm on the, oh yes, I am on the right line. Okay. Well, I don't even think I knew that. It says he was in Cleveland, Ohio from 1908 to 1910. I don't think I knew that. So now I have to go digging into that. But anyway, there's where he was going in Arlington, New Jersey. He had a friend who was there. His height, his hair color, his eye color, and then his place of birth, Zavadka, Austria. So, well, I'm glad I gave this talk. Now I've got to go look for my great-grandfather in Cleveland, Ohio. I didn't know he was there. So you see what you can find on that. And then this is an instruction page. So you'll get these slides and you can have this, but this was on the back of the manifest. The nationality questions, this is how they were to determine who was what for a nationality. And then the answers to the other questions, this explains what they were supposed to write and what it meant. So we shouldn't assume what these terms mean. We need to find out what the people who wrote them down meant. And this document will help you do that. So these passenger lists sometimes have notations on them. Here's an example of one. See that number there, 185619. Hopefully you can see my mouse there. Non-immigrant alien stamp and so forth on this fellow. So this website here will help you understand these notations. A lot of times they relate to notations that the passenger list was later checked and a certificate was issued, maybe in connection with that person being naturalized. And these numbers might tell you to which court or at which time those checks were done and those certificates were issued. So that they may be very helpful to you to steer you to other records. And some of them also, the people are marked as being held for further examination. There may be a separate list that explains why they were held. Was it a health issue? Was it a concern that they were unable to support themselves in America? In some cases, it was simply that they were supposed to be meeting a relative, and the relative's status couldn't be verified. So somebody had to try to get the relative to come to the port to make sure they were going to take this person, and so forth and so on. But you find a lot of that in the separate lists that follow these in the records. So we talk about Ellis Island. There's a nice picture of it from about 1905, and it still looks beautiful. If you have never been there, you should go, because I've been there a couple times, and if you have any ancestry that came during this period of time, it's a really moving experience. And even if you don't, it's a big part of American history, and it's been really beautifully renovated, and of course very near the Statue of Liberty as well. So New York had overtaken Philadelphia by the mid-19th century as the major port of entry for European immigrants. But Ellis Island did not come into being until 1892. Before that, they arrived at a facility called Castle Garden, is where they mostly arrived. And then for a couple of years, they were at the barge office at the Battery. And then Ellis Island opened to process all these people in connection with the new Immigration Act and all of the additional steps that had to be taken. So the myth about the name being changed at Ellis Island. There's a nice article by the New York Public Library about that. The link is there for you, but the summary is, you see these passenger manifest lists. We just looked at some of them. They were not created at Ellis Island. You saw the law. They had to be created in Europe before the person left on board before the person got on board the ship. Because the captain was supposed to hand this manifest list to the officials at Ellis Island or whatever port it was when they arrived. They weren't creating the lists there, and the ship captains obviously did not want to be bringing people over as immigrants who were not going to be accepted and processed through, because if they were denied entry, the ship captain or the shipping line had to return the people back to the original port at their own expense. So the shipping lines had a very vested interest in making sure that anybody getting on that ship to come to the United States they were going to have sufficient documentation and credential to pass through the inspection on all those points. So those lists were drawn up as the people were at the port of departure before they got on the ship to leave. And a lot of times to aid in that, they presented documents of their maybe a passport or a military pass that they had or something else. They didn't strictly need that, but usually they had something like that, and the information was copied from that onto the manifest list. Now, you will find errors on these lists. Sometimes people change their ages a little bit if they could to try to make it easier to present themselves as a working age person, for example. And sometimes people traveled under somebody else's passport. I've seen that, where they come in under a completely different name, and later when they apply for naturalization, they indicate that their immigration is actually in this other name, that they borrowed someone's passport from their home village to come here for whatever reason. So you do find things like that. But the lists themselves, they also may contain spelling errors when things were copied down, or translation errors. For example, if the immigrant is a Slav and his name is Ivan or John, and at the port in Germany where he's leaving, the passenger or the clerk is transcribing it in German, Ivan might become Johann, for example. But beyond that, you don't get very many bad butcherings of names on the lists. The indexing of them, that's another story, but we'll get there. These people arrived. There was a cursory inspection, as we talked about, on arrival, and quarantine near Staten Island. Then they were placed on steamboats and ferried out to Ellis Island, and they had a tag on them which had their line entry from the manifest. You saw that one where we were looking at line 8. That way, when they went to be processed, the clerk could easily find the relevant line, and then they could say, okay, this person's page 12, line 8, and then they would proceed with the help of interpreters to ask them questions to verify that their answers were the same as what was on that list, so that somebody wasn't trying to pull a fast one. So here you go. Here's a nice picture from, I think, 1906 of these lines at Ellis Island where these people are coming through. And you can see that this is a line here for men, and women were often in a separate line. But you see, it's like going through an airport today. You have these weaving lines of people. But you see, if you look closely, all these people have these manifest tags on them, so that when they get up there, they'll be able to turn to the right page and so forth. Oh, there's a woman there. But you turn to the right page and you can find them quickly and verify their information. Medical inspections went as they passed through the line. Doctors were keeping an eye on them. If they saw anybody that looked ill or something was wrong with them, particularly their eyes, they marked them with chalk, and they would be pulled aside for further inspection. There were dozens and dozens of interpreters on staff at Ellis Island. to assist the clerks. And so depending on what your nationality was, as listed on your passenger manifest, you when you went up to be processed, an interpreter would be with you who could speak your language as well as English and help the clerk compare your answers to the questions with what they already had on the manifest to make sure that you were the correct person. After that everything went fine, then you were free to go. You were transported to the United States, and often you were taken to a train station and sent on your way. If there was an issue, then you were detained, as we talked about, until it was resolved one way or the other. All right, so I'm going to move kind of quickly through this because we're getting short on time, but Ellis Island's Statue of Liberty website has enormous, wonderful historical information. Go there, read about it. It's fascinating. They also have almost 2,000 oral interviews that were done in the mid to late 1900s of people who were still living, then quite elderly, who had passed through Ellis Island during its heyday. And they have them organized by all kinds of nationalities and dates of immigration and all sorts of things. And you can go on there and you may find a relative, but it's more likely that you won't, but you'll find perhaps somebody who immigrated at the same time as your family did, if they came during that period, and maybe from the same country. And you can listen to these audio recordings of these people talking about what it was like, what they went through, and how the experience was. So you should check that out for sure. Ellis Island's heyday came to a real crashing halt. It still continued on, but in 1924, the Immigration Act was passed. And this was the first law, with the exception of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, really, that really restricted European immigration to the United States, or any immigration. They looked at the 1890 census, figured out how many people of each nationality had been in the United States then, and then each year 2% of that total could receive a visa, and you could not immigrate without a visa. That's when that all started. So now the 1890 census was chosen in part because that was really before a lot of the Eastern and Southern Europeans, the Slavs, the Italians, and others had started coming here. So by limiting it to 2% per year of their 1890 numbers, you're really cutting down the number of those folks who are able to gain admission to the United States. Here's an example of a post-1924 Ellis Island passenger list. And this fellow on the first line, it's a Polish version, but in America, he was known as George Nachesti. And he lived with my great-grandparents in Valley View. He was a sort of an acquaintance / distant cousin. And but here's one of his. He arrived several times in the United States, but 1930 is when he arrived the first time on the ship America from Southampton. And there he is. There's his age. It's nice. Everything's all tight now. There's a mark there that shows that he apparently went for naturalization or something later, because he's got a number written there. He's literate and so forth. Where he's from, Zavadka, same village. Now you see he received visa 3628 as part of the quota system issued at Warsaw on the 13th of March, 1930. So he is subject to this new visa requirement, and he was lucky enough that he got one. And the second part of it, it talks about, here's his nearest relative in the old country. His father was still living there. He was going to New Jersey. He was actually going to my great-great aunt, his sister, although for some reason, instead of listing, that's who paid for his passage, but he was actually going to this acquaintance, and I don't know who he was there. And then it talks about his physical characteristics, and he wasn't an anarchist or a polygamist or anything like that. Now, I talked about 1957 when most of the lists that are online end, but of course, immigration did not end then. And it was obviously not just by ships anymore. Here's an example of a passenger card from 1962 that I found on a distant Ukrainian relative of mine who had actually gone to Argentina and settled, and then came to the United States to live or stay with her daughter in Ohio. And she arrived by airplane. And so you see her arrival. There's her passport number, where she's going in Ohio, where she lived in Buenos Aires, Argentina, when she was born, the badly butchered name of the town in Poland where she was born, when her visa was issued, the date that she arrived, and she was on flight INI 180, boarded at Buenos Aires. So even if they came by plane, there is a record. They may not all be online yet, but there's information out there. And that was on Ancestry.com. So this I'm not going to go through in detail. You're going to get these slides, but these are different ports, different years. This is what the National Archives has for customs lists for these major ports, and immigration lists 1891 forward for major ports and minor ports, and some more. One thing I will point out, two things on this list. New York, unfortunately, there was a fire at Ellis Island in 1897. So those nice immigration passenger lists from 1891, when they started, to 1897 for Ellis Island were destroyed in that fire. However, those customs lists, which are not as detailed, but at least they have the names and the ages and so on, they have survived and they have been digitized, and they're used in place of the lost passenger lists. So you won't get as much detail on those 6 years at Ellis Island, but you'll still get the lists of the names and the ages and the ship and all of that. Also, you'll see in 1895, the Canadian border crossings began to be systematically listed, most of them listed under St. Albans, Vermont, even though those include border crossings throughout the northern border of the United States. Where can you find these? Here's a whole list of some online, offline, free sites, pay sites, different, excuse me, different indexes, different abstracts you can use at your leisure. Some more there that are free. This Stephen Morse is wonderful because it does some Soundex searching of a lot of these sites that the sites themselves don't do. So you definitely want to check that out. And I can't emphasize enough that while the names were not very much butchered by these clerks, they were terribly butchered by the 21st century people who were indexing them to put them online. So if you can't find somebody in one of these sites, check the other ones, because somebody else may have indexed it for the website, and it may have they may have read it more correctly. So if you're stuck, check different versions on different websites. And so I'm just going to briefly talk about some other resources that are going to help lead you to these passenger lists if you're really stuck, or might add to them. So very briefly, and these could each be their own talk, so we're just going to quickly go through these. Naturalization records, they have existed even from when we were in the colonial time. There were oaths of allegiance taken during the Revolutionary War period. A lot of these you'll find in published Pennsylvania archives. You'll find them in old county records, things of that nature. After about the 1790s, you'll find formal U.S. naturalization records in county courthouses or federal courts or state courts. And there was a process to declare your intention, and then you filed a petition for naturalization. I'm going to talk about the USCIS shortly, but these often, especially the later you get, they list the date of arrival and the port of arrival, which may or may not be accurate based on the person's memory, but it gives you a clue. And it may list the place of origin as well, the town of origin in some cases. Later on, they actually had to cross-check the naturalization petitions with the passenger lists, and that's where you start seeing those notations on those passenger lists that I talked about to show that it had been checked, to verify that that person actually had come under that name at that time. Let me see here. All right, so departure lists, in other words, people leaving ports. A lot of people ask, are there records of people leaving the US? Unfortunately, there are none known. That just wasn't kept. But some places did keep those kind of lists. Hamburg kept lists of everybody leaving its ports, and I'll show you that in a moment. And they're on Ancestry. Bremen did too, but most of those were lost in World War II or destroyed for lack of space before that. But certain years from the 20th century have survived, and you can go to that website there and you can search them. A lot of people leaving from Europe transited through the United Kingdom. Their ship may have left German or Dutch or Belgian port, and then it stopped in the United Kingdom, and then they transited onto another ship, for example. Well, if they did that between 1890 and 1960, you can find those departing passenger lists from the UK online. And there is also some data from the port of Antwerp in Belgium. 1 year has survived of departures. And there are also these very interesting police immigration index dossiers that I've heard wonderful stories about, but I haven't really examined myself. But they're out there. Here's an example of a Hamburg passenger list, again, indexed on Ancestry from 1910. It's very hard to read with the bleed through, but here's 3 gentlemen from my one of my ancestral villages of Stefkowa in Poland, and their names, their ages, their town of origin, and it talks about what class passenger they were. And then at the top, it lists the date of their departure from Hamburg, and I think it gives the name of the ship. So if you can't find their arrival, you might be able to find their departure and then search that ship's arrival on the other websites, and may find their name that was misindexed or mistranscribed. This is another sort of back-end way to find it. Plus, if they left Hamburg before 1892 and came to North America, you may find the town of their origin on the Hamburg departure list, even though it was not recorded on the US Customs list. So if they came from Hamburg, definitely look at these departure lists because they're really, really helpful. It's just a shame they haven't survived for more of the other ports. Another resource, especially for later 20th century, mid-20th century immigrants, the Erelson Archives, which was the international tracing service of the Red Cross. They have a lot that's online for free of a lot of post-war refugees. They also have a lot that's not yet online. You can email them and they're really backlogged. Or you can contact the Holocaust Museum in Washington. They have a good working relationship with them. They have copies of a lot of their databases and microfilms, and they may be able to help you. So there's their website. And your relatives don't have to be Jewish or have gone through the Holocaust for relevant information to be in these documents. It's basically anyone who was persecuted by the Nazis or made a refugee by the results of the war. So there's a lot of names and a lot of information. Here's an example. So this is a snippet from some of these lists that are also digitized for free on Ancestry. It's a passenger list from Italy to Australia in 1949 of a bunch of displaced persons, refugees, who had been in the Falling-Bostel displaced persons camp in Germany. And you see their names are all listed, their nationality, their religious affiliation, their marital status and so forth, their date of birth, their town of origin in Europe, and various numbers associated. I don't know if this is their visa or what, but there are columns at the top that will help you figure that out, plus their occupation. So if you have war refugee, post-World War II refugee relatives, check these lists. And if your relatives were part of the wave that came right before World War I, check these lists because they may have had relatives who stayed behind in Europe and got caught up in World War II, and you may find additional family members in these types of records. And then another resource that you can use is from the Department of Homeland Security. They have a genealogy division. It's mainly for 20th century arrivals when they started keeping, excuse me, these kinds of records. You can see the different categories there, but if you have 20th century relatives arriving who fit into one of these categories, contact them. It's $65 to search. And then if they find anything, it's $65 to get a copy. They tried to raise the fee to several $100s for each of these, but it was blocked by a court. So if you want to have them check, do it now before that fee goes up. Some of their older files may be at the National Archives, so you may want to check there first. And you may not have to go through this program, but they have a lot of information. That's where I'm going to stop. It's been about an hour and a few minutes. So I'll leave you with this picture here. And this is something else you can get on these, especially the Ellis Island site and some of the others. You can get pictures of the ships, especially the late 19th and early 20th century. And that's the ship my great-great-grandmother came on, the Kunzelman, on the Red Star Line in 1911. So with that, I will open it up for questions, and I saw lots of blips happening, so I assume there are some here. Robin, do you want to read them, or how do you I don't know if we can do all of them, but why don't we do it that way?
Sure, I can do that. I'm just moving all my screens around, everyone. Just a moment. So we've had lots of questions coming through, and I do want to reiterate, I know I said it at the beginning of the program, but yes, you will be receiving all of Justin's slides. I hope you didn't frantically write down all of those web links. You will be getting the slides later today in a PDF. And of course, we are recording the program, so you will have the opportunity to watch this again, just to reabsorb everything. So, all right. Justin, the first question we received was, how complete are the passenger lists?
Well, I think that's sort of been answered through what we went through, but I'll summarize it this way. After 1820, very complete. You should find somebody, I mean, with probably rare exceptions, if they came by water in or after 1820. Before 1820, if they came on a ship for which the passenger list has survived, you will find them, but as we went over, most of the ships that came before 1820, the passenger list has not survived. So if they, I mean, the lists that have survived are complete, but there are lots and lots and lots of ships that came that there's just no list of who the passengers were on those ships. So you have to use some of those other records to try to piece together the facts surrounding their immigration.
Great, thank you. The next question is, are there any sources for immigration records for Newcastle, Delaware prior to 1800?
There is one book that I indicated somewhere back on the slides that mentions Pennsylvania and Delaware. That should have some in it. There were no lists kept there for the Germans like there were in Philadelphia. And it's going to be a hit or miss thing. You're going to probably find various published lists, maybe in William Philby's work and some others of some that have survived. Otherwise, you're going to have to look at naturalization records and try to piece it together that way, probably.
Great, thank you. The next question is, during what years did an American citizen female lose her citizenship if she married a non-citizen male?
Well, I don't have the years on the top of my head, but that was the case up until some point in the early 1900s. And then it was not the case, I believe, for a while, and then it became the case again for a little while. That period of time definitely ended, as I recall, sometime in the 40s. So there may have been a break in the middle, as from what I'm recalling, but the questioner is correct. That was the case. Citizenship was determined by the male. So if you married a non-citizen while that was in effect, you lost your citizenship.
And just to confirm, you mean the 1940s?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
No, it's okay. Just
could mean any of a number of centuries, I guess. There.
Yes. All right. So the next question is for me, actually, Justin. So someone asked, can you please give a quick overview of your library? Hoping to visit soon. So yes, and Justin, please add to this, because I know you've been going to this library much longer than I've worked there. But so the Pennsylvania Room is a branch of Center County Library and Historical Museum, which is a public library system. And the Pennsylvania Room is a genealogical and historical reference library. So we specialize in those resources that will help you do genealogy and local history research. One of the things that makes our collection special, one of the many things, is that we have a county by county reference collection, which is really helpful for very specific county research. But as Justin mentioned, we've got lots of records that are relevant to many, many locations because, you know, things like passenger lists obviously, you know, capture people who moved all over the United States. I will send out, when I send out the email, I will also link out to the web page that provides information about visiting us right now. We are open for limited in-house services at this time. So I'm not going to bore you with all of that, but I will make sure that a link to that information is included in the email that goes out with the PDF. Justin, anything else you want to highlight about the library?
Well, I guess what I can say is, I mean, you know, in the past few decades, obviously there's a lot of stuff that has gone online. The major databases making things very, very easy. But there's a lot more information, and I think we touched on some of it here, beyond those easy, low-hanging fruit. And I would say that the Pennsylvania Room and its collections are the best place. If you have ancestry in Center County, that it is the best place to go. Yes, you'll find some things there that are also online, but you're going to find a lot of other things there that are not online, and you're going to find a lot of random miscellaneous things that might have the clue to your research, everything from a funeral home record to Mrs. Spangler's handwritten notes from a family Bible that she saw, to the original tax lists and things that may not be so clear on microfilm. You know, it's good to just go there and just sort of look through and dig around, and you'll be amazed at what you find.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if you are either not able to or do not want to visit us in person, we do offer offsite research services. So the next question is, this is a great question. This is a great genealogy question in general. Just because we find a name on a list, how can we decide if it's the right person?
Ah, that's a great question. Yes. Well, it's context, context, context. So whenever you're researching an immigrant ancestor, it doesn't matter when they came, what you really should do is you need to research everything you can find about them here in America, in the United States where they are. You need to try to find out, you know, everything. When did they die? Where did they die? What was their religion? Where did they live? What did they do for a living? Were they in a census? Can you get an approximate date of birth, or maybe an exact date of birth? Where did they settle in the United States? Who was their spouse? Who were their children? Were there people like witnesses to wills or deeds or neighbors that were of the same nationality? And it looks like they may have either been relatives or neighbors or friends of some kind. Then when you start looking in the passenger lists and you find, you know, a million, you know, Heinrich Schmidts or something, well, you're going to have a lot more success if you know that, you know, the age is approximately right, the occupation's approximately right, the people around him on the list are the same as either his family members or his neighbors that you know, in North America. His occupation perhaps is the same. His religion, if that's listed, is the same or similar. And the same thing, you pay attention to the dates. I mean, if he's here on the 1850 census with his wife and 5 children, and it says they were all born in Pennsylvania, you know, somebody who came in 1857 as a single laborer, that's not going to be him. So you need to pay attention to the context, construct your timeline, find out what you can about the person here, and then look for a passenger list, not only with that name, but with circumstances that fits the person that you now know.
Great, thank you so much, Justin. The next question I'm going to answer. So I had heard somewhere that the CCHS provides services to convert reel-to-reel or VHS to CD electronic files. Is that the case, and what is the cost? So this is a great question. One thing I do want to just make sure is clear. So the Center County Historical Society is actually a separate organization from us. We are the library system. So Center County Library and Historical Museum. We love the Historical Society. They're great friends. We work with them all the time, but different building, different services. But yes, so Center County Library and Historical Museum does have a free to use digitization station. And it is housed in the Pennsylvania room. It is called the Memory Lab, and we do not convert things for people. It is a service that you can basically check out. You make a reservation and you come in and convert your outdated media, whether that is a 3.5-inch floppy disk or a VHS tape, and a standard audio cassette tape, slides, negatives, photographs. You can convert all of those at the Memory Lab. So I can include a link to the Memory Lab in the information that I send out as well. Justin, did you have anything you wanted to add about
No, except that I've used it on occasion, and it's a wonderful resource. So go for it and make sure to preserve your family treasures, because the generations to come will be thrilled if they have videos or audios or pictures that you've preserved for them. We wish our ancestors would have done more. Well, we can do it for our descendants.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the next question is, can we get the recording of this on YouTube? Yes, this will be going on YouTube in a few weeks. I have some other things I need to edit and get on there first, but when this does go up on YouTube, I will make sure that everyone who is registered for this program gets an email about the recording so that you can watch it again if you would like. Next question. Did some of the very early Germans whose ships went first to England get off and stay there? And how could we trace them?
Some of them did. Actually, all of them disembarked there. They were encamped in England in various places for months and months and months before a decision was made regarding how to transport these people to New York. It was a real debacle. And the story of the 1709ers, like I said, is really fascinating. And there's a lot of books written about it. I recommend, if that interests you, you should check into that. I don't know how many actually stayed in England proper. Some probably did. And you may find there are different Palatine societies. There were a number that ended up going to Ireland, and there is a book written about the Palatines of Ireland that has a lot of names that Henry Jones did. And I would start with his works, and then from there I would start looking into the Palatine societies. I don't know if there's one in England, but there may very well be, and contact them if you think that might be a possibility, because that was definitely a phenomenon of that. So.
Great, thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. So the next one is, I have a relative who is part of the orphan trains out of New York City. Any suggestions in finding info on her?
Oh my, that's not an area that I've really done anything with. I've heard of the orphan trains, but I've never delved into that. Yeah, unfortunately, there's just not a whole lot I can offer on that part. But other than to say, I will throw this out, and maybe this will help you. There's a website online called Cindy's List, and it was just featured. It's had its 25th anniversary. It's got thousands and thousands and thousands, maybe millions at this point, of links or of genealogical interest organized by subject. If you go on there, I would be very surprised if there are not links to some organizations relating to the orphan trains. And so I would start there, because you may find people through that who are quite expert in that area and can help you with that question.
Great. So the next one is, have you found the information in older genealogy books pretty accurate? I've noticed some of the earlier books written in the late 1800s were written based on talks with local families about their families.
Right. I found a lot of inaccuracies in those books, usually not of the wholesale fraud variety, although sometimes you do find that too. But again, I mean, let's say somebody showed up at your door And let's say you had not done any real family research. And of course, there was not telephone and all of that in those days. And somebody said, well, what can you tell me about your family? And you say, well, I remember my grandfather, and he died when I was about 6, and you don't remember the year. And well, what was before him? Well, I don't know. Somebody said they were from Germany at some point. And you see how this sort of thing gets condensed down into a statement in a book that is what the person knew firsthand that they were telling is probably pretty close to accurate. But the further afield you get from that, it's just like today. How much would you know if you hadn't done the research about generations of people who lived before you were born? You might know something, but what you know may not be right. You may have misheard something, and your memory may not be right on it. And so you just sort of have to take that as a clue. That's what that person thought it was at that time. Maybe they were right, maybe they weren't, but it's a place to start.
Great, thank you. The next question is a little more general. Can you recommend a good book on the early history of Centre County and the townships of that area before Centre County was formed?
Well, the best book by far, in my opinion, that's comprehensive is Lynn's History of Centre and Clinton Counties. It was printed in 1883, and it's still available from the Centre County Historical Society in book form, and I think you can find older versions online too, older printings of it. It chronicles the history from the first settlement in 1769 right up through the late 1800s. And are there errors in it? Sure. Did Lynn have all the sources that we have today? Not necessarily, although he had some in particular newspapers that we don't have today, that he was able to review and read. That one of them, reading through the American Patriot newspapers, this is just an aside, but reading through, there was recently discovered, I think in the state of Indiana, several bound volumes of a newspaper published in Bellefonte called the American Patriot in the 18-teens that had been relatively completely unknown here because there were no local copies surviving of that range. And it was recently scanned and digitized, and I've been going through it. And I have discovered that a lot of what John Blair Lynn wrote about during that period of the 18-teens, he was getting because he must have read through those same volumes of advertisements and news occurrences in those newspapers. And again, those newspapers were lost to us until relatively recently. And there were other such things that Lynn had access to that did not survive. But fortunately, his recording of what was in them did survive. So I would still say go with Lynn and he gives you a good sense, and then you can branch out from there.
And I'm going to reiterate, because there was a question in the comments, Justin, again, the title was John Blair Lynn is the author, and the book is The History of Centre and Clinton Counties. That's the abridged title. And we have a link to it in the comments.
All right.
So everyone, we are rapidly running out of time. Justin, I want to thank you so much for your time today and sharing your knowledge and expertise. We really appreciate you really gifting this time to us and also your knowledge.
Well, thank you. It's always been a pleasure for me. I love the discovery. I found so much about my family and this area over the years. And it's just nice to be able to talk about it and have a captive audience who hopefully were not bored. It's nice to be able to, I love it. I'll put a plug in here too for the Pennsylvania Room. The Centre County Library has these regular coffee, I'm going to call them coffee hours. I know that's not the right title, online on Zoom recently due to the pandemic. And I hope those continue because a few of us gather together on random days. We sign up for these, and you can just sort of network, share family stories. We can ask questions of one another, find connections. And that's where the fun of all this is, to talk with like-minded folks and explore these mysteries. It's just a lot of fun for me, and I hope it is for all of you too. And if you found this of value, please give the Centre County Library and the Pennsylvania Room your attention and your patronage. Would be my suggestion.
Justin, thank you so much for your kind words and for giving us your time and knowledge today. We're all so appreciative of it. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed learning all about passenger lists and other related resources that can help with genealogical exploration today. Please note Justin's contact information on the slide and the contact information for the Pennsylvania Room and the Historical Museum. We hope you learned a lot today, and we trust that we'll see you again for a future presentation. Thank you.